I'm Sean Curran, and this is Politics UK. Welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights. I'll be joined by correspondents in Edinburgh and Cardiff, and here in Westminster by our parliamentary correspondent, Susan Hume. On the programme this week...
Is now the right time for tax cuts, Chancellor?
The Chancellor gives his autumn statement, cutting 2% off the main rate of national insurance.
That change will help 27 million people. It means someone on the average salary of £35,000 will save over £450.
The economy is now forecast to be £40 billion smaller by 2027 than the Chancellor said back in March.
Yep. At Prime Minister's Questions, Keir Starmer pushes the Prime Minister on NHS waiting lists.
More than double the entire population of Wales are currently on a waiting list in England. He really needs to take some responsibility.
In Wales, over 70,000 people are waiting over 18 months for treatment, compared to in England, where thanks to our efforts, we have virtually eliminated 18 months wait.
With no solution in sight to the conflict in Gaza, Scotland's First Minister calls for the Palestinian territories to be recognised as a state.
I've written to the Prime Minister and to Sir Keir Starmer and urged them to immediately take steps to ensure the UK recognises the state of Palestine.
We do not agree with that. We believe our position is a mainstream one, it is shared by the President of the United States of America, it is shared by the leadership of both the Conservative and Labour parties.
And the former Prime Minister and new Foreign Secretary, David Cameron, is sworn into the House of Lords.
I, David, Lord Cameron of Chipping Norton, do swear by Almighty God that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to His Majesty King Charles, his heirs and successors, according to law.
Well, Susan, we had days of speculation about possible tax cuts ahead of the Chancellor's autumn statement. Jeremy Hunt delivered that statement on Wednesday, and yes, there were cuts, but they were to national insurance rather than income tax. What were the main points from this statement setting out his plans for tax and spending?
Yes, so the statement lasted nearly an hour, so we won't go through all of them because that would take much too long. As you say, the eye-catching bit was that cut in national insurance, but lots of other tax cuts for business in particular and incentives to get them to invest. Something called expensing, which was a new term on me. It's not about long lunches with clients, but about investing in, for example, new equipment. On welfare, there were rises in line with inflation, but also for people who are long-term unemployed but not sick or disabled or anything, more incentives to try and get them into work. Indeed, a bit of a big stick saying if people don't engage and really try to get a job, they'll have their benefits withdrawn. The idea behind all of this is growth. That's what the Chancellor kept mentioning. And of course, growth is the holy grail for politicians and economists and all of us, really, because it makes a lot of problems go away if you have growth. Problems such as how to fund public services and national debt borrowing, those kind of things rather disappear if you have growth. Labour were very keen to point out, though, that the forecasts for growth have actually been downgraded. And they also said that, yeah, there's a tax cut, but actually, the end of next year, we'll be paying more overall in tax, not less. But the Chancellor was keen to point out the difficult circumstances that he was working in.
After a global pandemic and energy crisis, we have taken difficult decisions to put our economy back on track. We've supported families with rising bills, cut borrowing and halved inflation. Rather than a recession, the economy has grown. Rather than falling as predicted, real incomes have risen. Our plan for the British economy is working, but the work is not done. In today's autumn statement for growth, our choice is not big government, high spending and high tax, because we know that leads to less growth, not more. Instead, we reduce debt, cut taxes and reward work. I know there's been some speculation that we would increase benefits next year by the lower October figure for inflation, but cost of living pressures remain at their most acute for the poorest families. So instead, the government has decided to increase universal credit and other benefits from next April by 6.7%, in line with September's inflation figure, an average increase of £470 for 5.5 million households next year. Vital support to those on the very lowest incomes from a compassionate Conservative government. Today, we honour our commitment to the triple lock in full. From April 24, we will increase the full new state pension by 8.5% to £221.20 a week, worth up to £900 more a year. After careful consideration and in recognition of the contribution made by self-employed people to our country, I can announce that we are abolishing Class 2 national insurance altogether, saving the average self-employed person £192 a year. In 2021, my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, introduced the super deduction for large businesses to further stimulate business investment. And this spring, I introduced full expensing for 3 years. This means that for every £1 million a company invests, they get £250,000 off their tax bill in the very same year. I will today make full expensing permanent. That is the largest business tax cut in modern British history. We'll provide a further £1.3 billion of funding to offer extra help to the 300,000 people who've been unemployed for over a year without any sickness or disability. But we will ask for something in return. If after 18 months of intensive support, job seekers have not found a job, we'll roll out a programme requiring them to take part in mandatory work placement to increase their skills and improve their employability. And if they choose not to engage with the work search process for 6 months, we will close their case and stop their benefits. If we want people to get up early in the morning, if we want them to work nights, if we want an economy where people go the extra mile and work hard, then we need to recognise that their hard work benefits us all. So today, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to cut the main 12% rate of employee national insurance. If I cut it by 1 percentage point to 11%, that would be an extra £225 in the pockets of the average worker every year. But instead, I'm going to go further and cut the main rate of employee national insurance by 2 percentage points from 12% to 10%. That change will help 27 million people. We are delivering the biggest business tax cut in modern British history, the largest ever cut to employee and self-employed national insurance, and the biggest package of tax cuts to be implemented since the 1980s, an autumn statement for a country that has turned a corner, an autumn statement for growth, which I commend to the House.
Rachel Reeves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, the Chancellor has lifted the lid on 13 years of economic failure. We were told that this was to be an autumn statement for growth, but the economy is now forecast to be £40 billion smaller by 2027 than the Chancellor said back in March. Growth revised down next year, the year after, and the year after that too. The Chancellor claims that the economy has turned a corner, yet the truth is that under the Conservatives, growth has hit a dead end. What has been laid bare today is the full scale of the damage that this government has done to our economy over 13 years. And nothing that has been announced today will remotely compensate. Mortgages rising, taxes eating into wages, inflation high with prices still going up in the shops, public services on their knees and too many families struggling to make ends meet. As the sun begins to set on this divided, out of touch, weak government, the only conclusion that the British people will reach is this. After 13 years of Conservatives, the economy is simply not working, and despite all the promises today, working people are still worse off.
Now, Susan, we saw Keir Starmer on the Labour front bench there. He'd been taking part in Prime Minister's questions just before that statement, but he decided to go on a completely different topic, NHS waiting lists. What was his line of attack?
Yeah, of course, no point talking about the economy just a few minutes, really, before that autumn statement. So, as you say, Keir Starmer concentrated on health, and waiting lists, of course, are always brought into rather sharp focus at this time of year, going into winter, when more people get sick and need to use hospitals and add to those waiting lists and the pressures there. So, Keir Starmer had questions about that, but he moved on to talk more specifically about mental health care, especially for young people who often struggle to get the help they need.
This week, the Prime Minister unveiled the latest version of his 5 pledges for the country. Let's hope he has more success with these than the last ones. Did he forget the NHS?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, not only when I became Prime Minister, just weeks after becoming Prime Minister, we injected record funding into the NHS and in social care. We also unveiled the first ever long-term workforce plan in the NHS's 75-year history.
The reason he ignored the NHS, not only in his new pledges, but just now, is because 7.8 million people are currently on the waiting lists. That's 500,000 more than when he pledged to bring them down nearly a year ago.
We're doing an enormous amount to bring waiting lists down. Enormous amount. Expanding patient choice, rolling out new community diagnostic centres, new surgical hubs, as well as putting more doctors and nurses in our ward. But I guess the question, Mr. Speaker, is when he talks about targets and waiting lists, I really just hope that the Welsh Labour government aren't listening. Because after 25 years in power, they're missing every single one of his targets. Weren't they meant to be his blueprint?
Mr. Speaker, more than double the entire population of Wales are currently on a waiting list in England. He really needs to take some responsibility. And on his watch, 2.5 million people are too sick to work, with the majority also suffering from mental health issues. On top of his failures on waiting lists, can he tell us how many people are waiting for mental health treatment?
Well, actually, Mr. Speaker, we've injected record sums to expand the number of mental health treatments in our country. The union action that he fails to condemn and that his members of Parliament support from the picket lines have led to several 100,000 cancelled appointments, all making waiting lists worse. And he asked about Wales, but we can look at it. In Wales, over 70,000 people are waiting over 18 months for treatment, compared to in England, where thanks to our efforts, we have virtually eliminated 18 months wait. And that's the difference between us, Mr. Speaker. He wants to play politics, we get things done.
If we were to scrap tax loopholes, we could have thousands more staff, more support in our schools, more support in our communities. That would allow us to treat patients on time, getting them back to work. That's Labour's plan. Will he back it?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, it was this government that for the first time in the NHS's history ensured that it had a long-term workforce plan, providing it with record funding so that we can eliminate long waits, but also ensuring that it has the money that it needs to train record numbers of doctors and nurses, whilst radically reforming how they work to improve productivity, because the only way we will get everyone the treatment that they need is to make sure that the NHS has a fantastic staff that it needs, and it's this government that has put that in place. Labour's record on this issue is clear. It was a disastrous failure of workforce planning. And those weren't my words, Mr. Speaker. Those was the verdict of the Labour-chaired Health Select Committee. It was Labour that did not train the consultants that we would need now, that take 13, 14, 15 or years to train, And it's this government that is for the first time making sure that every family will finally have the doctors and nurses that they need.
SNP leader Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think all of us in the Chamber are united in our relief at reports that hostages are due to be released by Hamas in Gaza. But we can't afford to lose sight of what comes at the other side of the temporary pause in hostilities that we are about to see. At the end of 4 days, do we simply see the return to the killing of children in Gaza every 10 minutes? Or do we choose in this House to instead back a permanent ceasefire?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we do welcome the agreement reached overnight. And as I said, this is something that we have consistently pushed for and is a crucial first step as we try and resolve this situation and, indeed, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Of course, we want to see all hostages released as quickly as possible, including British nationals, and I would urge all parties involved to deliver the agreement in full.
Thank you, Susan, and we'll hear more from you a little bit later on. To Edinburgh now, and our Scotland political reporter, Jenny Davidson, who's at the Scottish Parliament in Holyrood. Now, Jenny, the row over the Scottish Health Secretary's iPad continues. We had that emotional statement last week when he admitted that his children had run up a huge data roaming bill on his official device. They were watching football, but the opposition parties still think there are questions to answer, don't they?
That's right. Michael Matheson made that statement to Parliament last week, admitting that that £11,000 roaming bill on his Scottish Parliament iPad that was run up on a family holiday to Morocco had been caused by his son's streaming football. He said then he'd referred himself to the Scottish Parliament corporate body. That's the management group made up of MSPs and the presiding officer that runs the Scottish Parliament. But earlier in the week, the corporate body made a statement saying they have no such process for MSPs to self-refer to them, and they'd have to consider further what they were going to do. So on Wednesday, Scottish Conservative MSP Craig Hoy raised a point of order asking how his party could get answers to their questions.
We have tried repeatedly to get answers from this government and this Parliament, yet since last Thursday we have been frustrated at every turn. Mr Matheson has referred himself to this Parliament's corporate body, but yesterday the self-same body said that no such process actually exists. Topical questions have been rejected. Urgent questions have been refused. Debate requests have been dismissed. A request for a further statement received the response that such a statement would be inadmissible. And all the while, the facts keep changing. The lessened Deputy Presiding Officer from all great political scandals tells us that the cover-up is often worse than the crime. And it is now abundantly clear that the SNP are in an industrial cover-up, closing ranks to avoid the truth getting out.
Thank you, Mr Hoy. In response to the point that you have raised, in relation to the SPCB, it is indicated that self-referral is not possible, but it is also indicated that it is due to meet tomorrow to consider the matter further and will issue a statement following that meeting.
And on Thursday, we got a follow-up from the Scottish Parliament corporate body saying that despite there not being that self-referral process in place, they are taking forward an investigation into that claim for £11,000 of public money, and there are some options open depending what they find. They could refer the matter then on to Holyrood's Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee. They could recommend sanctions, for example, barring Michael Matheson from claiming expenses for a certain period of time.
And Jenny, this subject also dominated First Minister's questions, didn't it? I mean, how is it all going to be sorted out?
Well, it's very difficult. There's so many questions around this. While the corporate body is looking into the expenses claim itself, opposition parties are focusing more on that matter of honesty, because it's quite clear from Michael Matheson's statement that he was still assuring journalists and therefore the public that this was an expense run-up in his work as an MSP after he knew that it was actually due to his son's streaming football. And this week on BBC Radio Scotland, the Deputy First Minister, Shona Robeson, was pressed really on whether ministers always tell the truth, and she could only say that she aims, and the Scottish Government aims, to tell the truth. And this matter of trust and honesty in the Scottish Government was picked up by Labour's Anna Sarwar.
The Salmon Inquiry, the ferry scandal, the failures at the Queen Elizabeth in Glasgow and the sick kids in Edinburgh, deleted COVID WhatsApp messages, and now the Deputy First Minister now saying they only aim to tell the truth. Under the SNP, trust and faith in Scotland's institutions has been lost. Isn't it the case, as represented by the good people of Rutherglen and Hamilton West, that this is a government that is running out of road, desperate to save their jobs and willing to say anything to cling on to power?
Anna Sarwar talks about trust, he talks about values. Well, I'm sorry, I do not know what the values are of Sir Keir Starmer when it comes to the UK Labour Party. Well, actually, I take that back. I do know what the values of Sir Keir Starmer are. The values of Sir Keir Starmer are to make sure that he retains the two-child limit, to make sure he retains the bedroom tax, to make sure he retains the rape clause. Something, of course, Anna Sarwar disagreed with and now suddenly agrees with. So we know what our values are, and nobody from London, nobody from party headquarters will tell us otherwise.
Now, on that matter of the iPad, the First Minister said he's not going to comment further while that investigation is ongoing. But it's quite clear that the questions about it are still ongoing as well.
Now, Jenny, Gaza continues to get regular mentions in the Scottish Parliament, even though foreign policy is not a devolved matter. The First Minister's in-laws were in Gaza when the conflict started. They've now made it safely back to Scotland. But Humza Yousaf raised the subject of the war again this week, didn't he?
Yes, that's right. There was a debate at Holyrood this week calling for a ceasefire. It's a difficult issue, particularly for Labour, obviously, with Scottish Labour backing a full ceasefire, UK Labour calling for a humanitarian pause. But this week, in that call for a full ceasefire, the majority of MSPs voted for it. That included Scottish Labour, only the Scottish Conservatives voting against that. And Humza Yousaf, the First Minister, called for an end to the cycle of violence, and he called for a two-state solution.
So it's simply not enough anymore to pay lip service to a two-state solution. We must take steps to turn that into a reality. To that end, I have written to the Prime Minister and to Sir Keir Starmer and urged them to immediately take steps to ensure the UK recognises the state of Palestine. It's only with full recognition of Palestine as a state in its own right that we can truly move forward towards a two-state solution.
We do not agree with that. We believe our position is a mainstream one. It is shared by the President of the United States of America. It is shared by the leadership of both the Conservative and Labour parties at a UK level. Like any sovereign state, Israel has a right to defend itself against terrorists. But every precaution must be taken by the Israeli government to protect innocent civilians.
So by calling for an immediate ceasefire today, I hope that this is not just a moment where this Parliament and those who want peace across the world unite to call for a ceasefire. I hope this is a game changer in this decades-long conflict, so that we can finally give the people of Palestine and the people of Israel the peace and the justice that they so desperately need and so desperately demand.
And of course, the other big issue is the one you've been discussing, the autumn statement. The Scottish Government will now be digesting that, finding out what it means for Scotland, and we're likely to hear more about that at the Scottish budget next month. But the Deputy First Minister, Shona Robeson, has described it as the worst case scenario for Scotland's finances. So quite clear the Scottish Government didn't exactly get what they wanted in that.
Jenny Davison at Holyrood, thank you very much. Now, back to Westminster and our parliamentary correspondent, Susan Hume. And Susan, there was a big announcement this week from the government about levelling up for England, Scotland and Wales. There's £1 billion they're going to spend, but joy was not unconfined in the Commons, was it?
The joy was certainly quite patchy, Sean. And to explain that, we'll go back to how this works. There's this fund, this levelling up fund. Local areas make pitches and with projects that they would like to fund, and the government chooses which ones are going to get some money. So very much winners and losers. You won't be surprised to hear that the MPs with areas that were winners were pretty pleased, and that includes some Labour MPs. The losers not so happy, a lot of disappointment there. Particularly though in Northern Ireland, because Northern Ireland didn't get any money in this round. The government says it's not getting any money until the Assembly and the Executive are back up and running. They were collapsed, you'll remember, by the DUP. The DUP is furious, saying that the government's really trying to strong-arm them into going back into that power sharing. But first, we'll hear what the Minister had to say about it all. Let's have a listen.
Today, Mr Speaker, I'm delighted to confirm the allocations of the Levelling Up Fund's third and final round, investing £1 billion in 55 projects across England, Scotland and Wales. From Chorley, Mr Speaker, to Elgin and Doncaster to Rhyl, these local infrastructure projects will restore pride in place and improve everyday life for local people. We've targeted funding at places most in need, as identified through our Levelling Up Needs metrics. We've also ensured that there is a fair geographic spread across Great Britain, including £122 million across 6 projects in Scotland and £111 million across 7 projects in Wales.
Commiserations to all those areas who have missed out once again. Although the truth is, Mr Speaker, even those areas who have won will find that this money is a drop in the ocean compared to the £15 billion cut from local government funding since 2010.
Today I am delighted to see that Brixham Harbour and the Epic Centre and Torbay Business Park have been recognised with £20 million of support, and this is going to make a huge difference. Wales, Northern Ireland, the North East, the North West, East Midlands, Yorkshire and the Humber. There was no mention in his statement of the South West.
I'm delighted to confirm to the honourable member that the South West region has received 20 projects across the rounds of the Levelling Up Fund to a total value of £409 million.
People in Northern Ireland will be angry tonight that a fund which the Minister describes as creating opportunities across all regions and nations of the UK and aimed at tackling regional inequality, sees not one penny allocated to Northern Ireland. Is this not a case of blatant, pathetic, transparent economic blackmail to try and get the Assembly up and running again without addressing the reasons why it failed in the first place, and using the money to pour into key Conservative constituencies, marginal constituencies, to bolster up party support?
I share my honourable friend's frustration that we've been unable to fund projects in Northern Ireland this time around. As I've already indicated to him, that's because of a lack of an executive in Northern Ireland. But what I would say to him, I would give him the assurance that we've set aside what Northern Ireland's allocation would have been in this round, and I commit to working with him and his colleagues to ensure that Northern Ireland does receive the full benefits of levelling up.
I've lost my voice in cheering for the £1.1 million for Swadlincote Town. It's the first time in 50 years that government money has been put in to regenerating this area. It's the heart of South Derbyshire, and I thank him very much indeed.
My goodness, what a con it says. We heard earlier this year from the National Audit Office of the £9.5 billion that was allocated in the first round, only £1 billion had been spent. And so perhaps the Minister can answer the question of how much has been spent now, because this isn't the reality. This is much like any other Tory slogan. It is actually meaningless when it comes to the reality.
Now, Susan, many women attending abortion clinics have faced intimidation from anti-abortion protesters, and the government have said they're going to do something about it. The issue came up in the House of Lords this week when peers wanted to know exactly what the government was going to do. What did the Minister tell them?
Well, first of all, MPs did vote a year ago to create these buffer zones around abortion clinics in England and Wales to protect women going into them from protesters intimidating them. But medical and abortion groups have said that the Home Secretary Suella Braverman, former Home Secretary, actually failed to press go on that legislation, and indeed the government is now going to hold a public consultation on how that law should be enforced. So more delay there. And in the House of Lords, some peers wanted to know exactly what was going on.
There's a great deal of foot dragging in this. Both houses supported the Public Order Act 6 months ago, which would protect women accessing legal health care for their necessary rights. And yet, in these months, the most cruel demonstrations are going on outside clinics. For example, people wearing body cams holding up posters saying babies are being murdered here. I don't see that a consultation is necessary. I would urge the Minister not to delay the will of Parliament any longer, but to get on with it and protect women from these very cruel demonstrations.
In terms of the public consultation, this is new legislation on an emotive topic. There are strong views on all sides of the debate, and determining the appropriate balance will not always be straightforward. Therefore, in order to make sure the legislation can be implemented effectively, and that is the point, implemented effectively, the government has decided to launch a public consultation on the non-statutory guidance for safe access zones.
We need to take account of the fact that the previous Home Secretary voted against safe access zones and has a history of opposing abortion rights. So I think the Noble Lord needs to give us an example of where, when the will of Parliament is so clear, as it is in this case, it has been necessary to have this kind of public consultation.
Can I say, look, that the guidance is not straightforward because of the broad nature of the prohibited behaviours. For example, it is a criminal offence to intentionally or recklessly influence. And that means that members of the public, the police and prosecutors will benefit from being aware of what could be criminalised within the zones.
The victims are still worried. They're already terrified sometimes when they're having this treatment, and then they're further intimidated by some of the protests. So I wonder whether the Minister would agree with me. This consultation, important as it is, should not be taking so long. It's not a very complex thing to implement. We've implemented greater criminal changes far more quickly.
Whilst no one could defend intimidation or harassment, there are those who quietly pray. And this came up when we were debating this subject earlier in the year, and considerable concern was expressed in a number of quarters of the House.
This training will have to reflect Section 9 of the ECHR, which, as you know, is around the freedom of expression and manifestation of religion and belief. What I would also say is that those rights are heavily qualified.
It is the case that, as we speak, people have been arrested for praying outside abortion clinics, and however wacky we might consider it, that is a free speech matter. And secondly, in the context of a situation where the police don't seem to be able to know what intimidation is, whether outside a Labour MP's office or on the streets in terms of anti-Semitism, I hope that consultation will be as helpful as possible so that the police arrest the right people and don't end up policing easy targets instead.
Thank you, Susan, and we'll have more from you in a little while. Now, let's go to Cardiff and our Wales political correspondent, Daniel Davis, who's at the Welsh Parliament, the Senedd. Daniel, the Labour government in Wales has long promised a clean air law, but the Conservatives are worried about extra costs for drivers. What measures are likely to be implemented?
Well, that law and environment bill will, among other things, give Welsh Government ministers broad new powers to create clean air zones on the M4 motorway and other busy major A roads. And then the drivers of the most heavily polluting vehicles would have to pay to drive through those zones. Now, the Conservatives don't like it, and they tabled an amendment to the bill that would scrub those powers from the legislation because they say they're unfair to people who have to rely on their cars, who have no other means of getting about, as the Tory Senedd member Janet Finch-Saunders explained.
We're the first to admit we do need to cut down our reliance on cars, and we need to walk more, we need to cycle more, and we need to be able to use public transport where we can. But in some instances, that is not an option, and cars are an only option. So many people commute from areas where public transport is poor, and that is because of your government's failure to adequately support public transport.
There are no current plans to introduce trunk road charges. The Deputy Minister for Climate Change has already been clear on this. But as he has pointed out previously, clean air zones are listed in our air quality plan as precautionary retained measures, which could be introduced on certain roads if other measures prove insufficient to meet our obligations.
Now, we got a flavour of the government's position from the Climate Change Minister there. She said although the legislation would give the government these powers, it doesn't intend to use them. It hopes that 50-mile-per-hour zones on the M4 and in other places will bring down the levels of pollution. They would only introduce charges if that measure fails. Now, that Tory amendment was defeated quite easily. There was another amendment, however, which was much closer, that would have required the government to bring in more stringent targets on the pollution that comes from traffic. That amendment was also defeated, but only just. So the bill proceeds pretty much as the government had intended. However, without those targets on more forms of pollution, health and environmental campaigners who've been pushing for this legislation say it simply isn't tough enough.
Now, Daniel, the bosses of the Welsh rail network have appeared before the Senedd and they've offered an apology to football fans. What were they saying sorry for?
Well, yes, frustration for Welsh football fans this week when the national side failed to automatically qualify for the next European Championships. But frustration for fans on public transport as well, particularly on the trains, particularly for fans travelling from North Wales down to see Wales international matches in Cardiff. This has been a long-running complaint, and there were problems again this week when Wales played Turkey in Cardiff. The bosses of Transport for Wales, which runs the network, were in the Senedd this week, and they apologised for those difficulties. They said that new trains had developed problems with their wheels. No one was quite sure why. There are various theories, but nevertheless, they said they were very sorry. But that wasn't good enough for the chairman of the Senate's Climate Change Committee, himself a football fan who was at that match, Dear Griffith.
But it's tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, isn't it? You're always very sorry. I mean, surely if you know there's a major event, you plan some sort of contingency, or you know, I know events happen and sort of things go wrong sometimes, but they seem to be going wrong all of the time when there's a major event, particularly the north-south connections.
I strongly believe we need more resilience and greater ability to do better on significant events, days, and football particularly. We have not had enough focus on that. We focus heavily on rugby. We focus heavily on major cultural events, and our performance has improved significantly on both of those. We have not traditionally focused on football, but that is something that we will be doing.
The idea that rugby has been a bigger priority than football will stick in the craw for many football fans. But that was the annual scrutiny session for Transport for Wales, where there were questions about the finances of that company. They're not selling as many tickets on the railway as they had hoped, and therefore the government is having to step in with a bigger subsidy. It's a major headache for the government because it's a drain on government resources. How long is this situation going to persist, they were asked. James Price, the chief executive of Transport for Wales, said they were performing better, but he doesn't expect the situation to recover overnight.
Now, the Welsh First Minister has issued an assurance to farmers plagued by bovine tuberculosis that they won't lose their businesses. What action is the Welsh Government going to take?
Well, TB in cattle is a huge problem in some parts of Wales. There have been all sorts of measures to try and eradicate it. In a debate about the latest campaign to eradicate bovine TB last week, one Labour backbencher, Joyce Watson, asked the government what were they going to do with farms that were perpetually in a TB status. She asked that if that was the case, then surely they need to find another business. Now, she's since apologised for those remarks, but not before the Welsh Tory leader, Andrew R.T. Davies, pounced on them at First Minister's question.
That really is a question which is not worthy of putting on the floor of the Senedd, because ultimately every livestock farm in this country has done everything that the government has asked of it. by meeting the biosecurity standards, going to annual testing, having pre-movement testing, and complying as best they can with every measure the government has put in place. The Minister, when she replied to that question, did not indicate whether the government was actively considering such measures to farms that will find themselves in perpetual TB.
I've read since that Joyce Watson has explained that had she had an opportunity to set out her views more fully, it was never her intention to suggest that people would be forced off the land. It was more a matter of expressing concern for the well-being of people who, time after time, in those hotspot areas, find that having taken action to attempt to eradicate TB, the disease comes back.
As I say, Joyce Watson has since retracted and apologised for her remarks. But what's really going on here is that opposition parties, like Cymru and the Conservatives, are trying to tell a story whereby the Labour Welsh Government doesn't care enough about rural communities. There was a cut to the rural affairs budget last week. The government, of course, rejects that. And in First Minister's questions, Mark Drakeford said that the government was spending millions of pounds every year providing a safety net for farmers whose cattle has been affected by bovine TB.
Daniel Davis at Cardiff Bay, thank you very much. Now, Susan, let's have a chat about David Cameron and his return to government and indeed to Westminster. The new Foreign Secretary, now a member of the House of Lords, introduced at the start of the week. Of course, it's the House of Lords. There's a certain amount of parliamentary glamour and formality, but there were some light-hearted moments as well.
Yeah, so right at the start of the week, David Cameron took his oath. So he was there in his ermine and scarlet robes, all very dashing. And the very next day, he made his maiden or first speech, opening it from the dispatch box on the Pacific trade deal that has to go through Parliament. It was all very jolly and friendly, of course. But David Cameron has got some controversy around this appointment, not just because he's appointed Foreign Secretary in the House of Lords, which makes it very difficult for MPs to question him, but also opposition parties are keeping up a lot of pressure over his business interests when he was out of government and over his links with China. We didn't hear too much about that in the House of Lords. He's no stranger to controversy because as a fresh-faced young advisor at the start of his career, he was an advisor to Norman Lamont when he was the Chancellor. In fact, in the middle of the Black Wednesday financial crisis more than 30 years ago. And the two of them are reunited in the House of Lords and can chew over old times.
There is a strong precedent for members of this House from all parties serving in the Cabinet. Peter Carrington and Alec Douglas-Hume, and more recently the noble Lords, Lord Mandelson, Lord Adonis, Lord Frost, the noble Baroness Lady Morgan of Coates. Like all of them, I respect the primacy of the other place. As tradition dictates, a Secretary of State who sits in the Lords is mirrored by the most senior minister in their department. That minister is the Right Honourable Andrew Mitchell MP, who will deputise for me in the other place, and I believe he'll do an excellent job. Yeah. I will look forward to answering Noble Lords' questions monthly and appear before all the relevant committees. I recognise my responsibilities to this House, and I'm happy to consider other appropriate mechanisms so that Parliament is able to scrutinise all the work of my department.
We had some difficult times together. There was one moment when the noble lord gave me a present. He may have forgotten this. It was a long mahogany box, about a foot long, and it contained the biggest Cuban cigar you could possibly imagine. There was a yellow notelet attached to it, which had, in his handwriting on it, the words, "By the time you smoke this, all your troubles will be over." Well, my lords, I never smoked it. I still have it. And at times when I was watching my noble friend as Prime Minister, I was tempted to send it back to him.
Thank you very much, Susan. And that's all for Politics UK for this week. Politics Live will be back on Monday at 12:15 on BBC Two and iPlayer.